Today on Adam P. E21's Garage, we do a brake job on the 2011 Yukon Hybrid, but we run into a little snag along the way when we go to do the braking in process. Hope you enjoy. Hey everybody, it's Adam again. Today we're going to work on our 2011 Yukon Denali Hybrid. Got a pretty big issue going on with the brakes here. Typically they'll start squeaking when they start getting worn out. Well, they've been squeaking for a while, and now I've got a nice loud grinding noise coming out of the back. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to replace the brakes in all four corners. The last time the brakes were gone through on this was right about when we bought them. The dealer replaced them. And that was at 67,000 miles. The truck has over 145 on it now. So 80,000 miles, yeah, it's about time to go ahead and refresh everything in all four corners. So we're gonna do the brake pads in all four corners. And I'm gonna see if we can actually get the rotors turned down at O'Reilly's. If not, then we'll have to go ahead and buy some new rotors as well. But it's time to get everything back on the road for this truck. Come along for the ride. It's a nice cold, brisk day here today, about 30 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The good news with that is we got some cold ones in our Midwestern refrigerator, and I'll introduce that here a little bit later. Enjoy. Let's take a closer look at the corner that's giving us problems here. So as you can see, it's quite the rough surface on there. Typically, once your pad is worn down all the way to where it's basically down to the metal, it's going to rough it up pretty bad there. And to be honest, well, I started hearing the scraping noise one day on the way back from up north in some snow. I tried to torque brake it to do a little icy burnout, and the next day is when I noticed the grinding noise happen. So I pretty much gave the pad all she got at that point, and now I'm out here fixing it. Another interesting thing here, so about these hybrids, the brake system on these works in tandem with the regenerative braking that happens. So we got an electric motor up inside there in the transmission, two motors actually. And when you let off the gas, the back tires are basically back driving those electric motors to charge up the nickel metal hydride batteries that are underneath the passenger seat in the middle row. So basically what happens is, and it's kind of interesting, when you slow down just about below 5 miles an hour, you can hear the rear brakes engage on this, especially when it's metal on metal scraping like that. So that's how I think these rear brakes lasted so long. The front brakes I know were replaced at the dealer when we bought it. The rear brakes, now that I think about it, I don't think they had ever actually done any maintenance on the rear brakes. So these are the original rotors, original pads, basically 145,000 miles on them. So it's time to go through them and get them swapped out here. We're going to start out with the problem child here, of course, in the back, but then we're going to go ahead and do all four corners here today. All right, let's get up real close and personal here. Look at this. So typically a rotor that's running on the nice friction of a pad, the friction surface of a pad there, you get that nice shiny surface. You definitely don't want these grooves out here. You know, if you feel around the outside, there isn't too much of a ridge on the outside of here. There's a little bit more on the inside, but that might be enough for the guys to machine it down. We'll see once we get over to the O'Reilly's there to see how they do with machining this guy down here. All right, we're gonna go ahead and remove two bolts on the back side of the brake caliper here. These are 18 millimeter bolts on this Yukon. And once we slide the caliper off of here, we're going to be careful not to stretch out the soft brake line here, because if you stretch it out, you can actually break the lining on the inside there, and it'll cause problems later. It'll cause problems holding pressure. We're going to pull that, set that up here, get these pads out of here, and then I guess the good news is there's no back washers or anything like that around this brake rotor here, so we'll just have to pound this guy to get them off. Might need to add a little PB blaster around there. In fact, we're going to go ahead and do that before we even start down here on the brake caliper bolts. Let's go a little in depth here. Here's the bolt that was holding in the brake caliper. You can see up around the midsection here, there's like a wax on there. Typically, especially in a safety critical component like the brakes, the OEMs will put Loctite around there. So once I got those broken loose with the breaker bar, went ahead and put the ratchet on there. The top one here in particular, it started to get hard after it was about halfway out. So a little trick of the trade, just screw it back in a little bit, keep on working it in and out. You never want to force something, especially if it's already backed out a little bit. Don't force it, because then you're liable to break that stud off inside the threaded area, and you're going to add about another 4 days, 4 years to your project. So got both these out on this side. We got the caliper up and out of the way. Let me show you what this pad looked like here. So this is the pad that was rubbing on the outside here, and we are down to bare metal right there. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is why when you first start to hear the metal, there's a little metal tab typically that's a wear indicator on here. I don't see it on this one. It may be on the other side. When you start to hear that thing squealing, it's time to replace the brakes. You definitely do not want this metal going on here for too long. And this was too long. There's absolutely no friction material left. Maybe there's a nano layer of friction material left on the outside of here, but it was definitely past time to change these guys out. So I pulled off the inner pad, and interestingly enough, it's got kind of a weird wear pattern down on the bottom of here. So I'm going to take a look at that once we get that off of there, but it's kind of beveled going down here. It's not completely flat. Also, you can see that the friction material is separated from the backing material here itself. So that little wear tab I was talking about wasn't actually rubbing on there, and I was down to steel on the outside here too. So I really hope that my caliper here isn't stuck and cause that to wear out too soon. But at the end of the day, even with that material separating like that, we really don't want that on the vehicle. So it's time to swap these guys out. That came off a heck of a lot easier than I expected. Just a couple of little hits there and that rotor came right off. So on the inside here, you know, you can see down around the inside that it's actually kind of fanned out a bit here. And I wonder if the corrosion, if the rust was kind of expanding that out. So, you know, we'll take this in, we'll see if they can machine that. But you're kind of looking at this, it looks pretty gnarly. So I might have to get a new one here. We'll see what happens. All right, so we're done on this side over here. We're gonna go ahead and move over to the next side on the rear, and we're gonna take that one off and see how that brake rotor looks. So on the driver's side here, outside she looks pretty good. Still got good rotor life left up on the top there. My pad's still probably in okay shape on the outside. On the inside, we'll have to take a look once we get this off of here, but about halfway down I can feel it gets pretty rough. So either it's rubbing on the backing plate there, or that plate just, or maybe the rotor just is rusted up enough that it's not nice and polished on the inside there. We'll take a look at that once we get this caliper off. So here's the driver's side rotor. You can see up on the inside here, about 2/3 of the way is roughed up and rusted there. So don't ask me why that happens. It's got enough pad on the inside there where, you know, you can see that there's still a good, not exactly good thickness of pad, but it wasn't down on the noise indicator there. But, you know, the pad itself kind of looks okay, although there's a lot of cracks on the inside of there too. So again, we'll see if the guys machine this off down here, but I guess I'm not counting on it. The outside pad actually has got quite a bit of life left on it, but also with this one, there's a crack forming around here too. It was time. A little bit about what a Midwestern refrigerator is. Nice thing about living in the cold parts of the US here, about the only nice thing about living there is I can put my beer in a box outside pretty much from the middle of November till about the beginning of April, I would say. The beer stays nice and cold out here, and I save probably about 50 cents a month on electric bill because my refrigerator doesn't have to keep that beer cold. Very easy to access as well. All right, so we got both of the rear rotors and brake calipers and brake pads off of there. Now we're gonna go over to the front, and knock on wood, it's actually been kind of easy getting these bolts off of here. I would have figured after 12 Michigan winters and all the salt and everything that goes along with it that we would have had a tough time getting those off the back there, but things are looking good so far. Hopefully before it gets dark out here, we'll get those front rotors and caliper pads off of there as well, and we'll be on our way over to get them machined tonight. So here's the driver's side front rotor. You know, outside looks pretty good here. Inside, kind of similar to the back, you got a ridge that's coming up on the bottom here. We're gonna go ahead and take the pads out, the caliper, and we'll take a look at those. Yep, I do. Oh my gosh. All right, honey, thanks for coming out. All right, so the inner pad was right about getting down. Actually, you can see just started to shine up on our wear indicator there, and there's probably only about 1 millimeter or 2 of friction surface left. This guy was ready to go, that's for sure. In fact, this shim on the outside here, dang near rusted through. That's looking pretty gnarly there. So good thing we're working on the front calipers here today too. So here was on the outside. Actually, this doesn't look too bad. You still got the outgassing area of the friction surface there on here, but really only about maybe 4 or 5 millimeters left there. So let's go to the passenger side. Oh boy, we had a close call, of course, on the last bolt that we got to pull out. So you'll notice the flats on the bolt are just about rounded off there, and it was stuck in there pretty good. So I tried to heat it up a little bit, but it's impossible to get at the threads on there. Heated it up, put a little bit of wax on there. I don't think that did much. But then what I did is I fully removed the bottom bolt down here, and then I just tapped the caliper back and forth a little bit to get this guy and kind of use the leverage that we got with the caliper out here to kind of start working this guy loose, and then managed to get that out. So I don't know if I'm going to chance it and put this bolt back on here or not. We'll figure that out later. One downside of adding heat down here too, I managed to kiss my little boot down here, so I'm gonna have to buy a boot redo kit here when I go ahead and put this one back together. Do a quick inspection here. So the rotor on the driver's side here looks pretty good on the outside. Back side doesn't look too bad. Got some of that corrosion again coming up into the friction part of the rotor there. This is the outer pad. That looks pretty darn good. And the inner pad getting a little bit worn down there, but still had quite a bit of life left on it. So there we are. We are over the hump here, and we're going to go ahead and take these rotors in. And this is my favorite part of any project, when the truck is immobile, no brakes, and it's up on jack stands at all four corners in the driveway. It's also my wife's favorite part of the project because she gets to look out the back window and see an immobile vehicle sitting in the driveway for Lord knows how long it's going to sit like this. But at least hopefully by summer of next year when it's warm out, we'll have all the brakes back on, and we'll have it out of the driveway again and back in commission. We stopped over at O'Reilly. They said that two of the rotors, one in the front, one in the back, were not salvageable. So rather than mix and match new and old rotors, I just decided I'd go ahead and get some new AC Delco ones online. Just want everything to look consistent on the truck, but basically what we're going to do, it's going to take a couple of days for those to get here. I'm going to go ahead and do some prep work though on the calipers underneath, and we're going to get the new pads put up in the calipers and press the pistons back in there as well to make room for the new rotors as well. And then by the time we get the new rotors in later this week, and since it gets dark here about 4:30 in the afternoon, all I'll have to do is just slap the rotors on and put the calipers in there as well, and we'll be back on the road later this week. And don't worry about these rotors, the ones that are still good. I'm basically just going to leave them in a pile over here next to the barn for the next, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Eventually they'll rust away, or I'll find time to take them to a scrapyard. The first thing we're going to do on the passenger side here in the front, we've got actually a little hole on the bottom side of the caliper in that boot. On the top here, when I heated up that bolt, I managed to touch that boot as well. So we're going to take both of these boots off over here and put the new boots on, and then we'll compress the caliper and put in the pads, and she'll be ready for the new rotors when they come in. That's a good thing we're taking this one off. It's moving a little bit there, but it definitely isn't smooth like this one is over here. So if these guys aren't operating smoothly, your caliper won't want to return easily, and it's a good reason why you could get worn out brake pads or prematurely worn brake pads. Also, there's grease on the inside there too. Like I said, they have to move in and out pretty smoothly in order for this not to stick. And then we'll have to basically jam that in there, pull it out. There's a metal sleeve that's around inside there that this boot sits on. And then we'll have to press that other one in there with our vise. So it is pretty dried up here. So we'll end up hitting that with a piece of sandpaper, Scotch-Brite, get her nice and cleaned up, greased up, and then we'll put it back together. So here's the old one that came off. You see you got the hole there. Basically just use a flat blade screwdriver to break this around the top here enough to get it to rotate in there. Once I rotated it, pretty much worked itself out. Here's a replacement, same kind of thing with the metal sleeve on there. We're gonna go ahead and just tap this guy right back down in there. So I'm going to use a 21 millimeter socket to get around the outside of this boot here and basically touch right on the face of the flange that goes around this and tap it right in there. That way we protect the boot as we're tapping it in. There we go. That guy's in there good. Let's go ahead and get this side taken care of here. And then we will clean these pins off, put a little more grease up inside there, and then put those pins back in there. All right, both of these guys are moving in there freely. Let's go ahead and get this mounted back up to the caliper and we'll move on to the next side. Now, before we put this bracket back on around here, we're gonna press the pistons back up into the brake caliper itself. So those guys are reset. By the time we put the new pads up inside there, it'll be open wide enough for the new discs to fit in there. What I use is a C-clamp and basically take the old pad, put it across there, and then pull these guys back together. If you've got a single piston on here, it's a lot simpler. You can just pretty much run the C-clamp up into the middle there. But when you got these dual pistons, they want to just continue to equalize. So if you press this guy in, typically this guy will pop back out. So you want to press these in at the same time. I use an old pad to do that. Other people say just bleed the brakes and so forth. You got the time, you can do that too, but this method has worked fine for me every time I've done a brake job. Just gonna press the piston effectively till it gets right about equal with the surface there, the outside of the caliper, and that ought to be far enough to get the new rotor to fit up underneath there. Now, the thing to keep in mind when you go ahead and get the truck back on the ground again and all the brakes are done, you got to pump the brakes up a little bit to make sure that your caliper and your pads are pressing on the brake rotor itself. There have been times, actually in my silver E36, when I did the brakes on that, I took off down the road, didn't pump up the brakes before I left. The first time I went to stop, the pedal went right to the floor. Had to do a little bit of panic pumping at that point, and we managed to stop before we got to the stop sign. So always keep that in mind. Now we're going to go ahead and put these back on, the brackets here, and then we're going to place the brake pads up inside the brackets once we get these secure. So pay close attention, you can see that the geometry is different. This one is more C-shaped, this one more, I guess you'd say, D-shaped here. This side has to go in against the pistons. This side goes on the outside against the back side, the reacting side of the caliper. All right, so we got the pads mounted up inside there. Got these tabs reacting against the pad here to hold it in on both sides. And got the caliper pistons pushed back in there as well. Nice and wide here. And by the time we get the rotor, hopefully it'll be just basically plug and play, get the rotor on, get the caliper mounted back up, and we're good to go. On to the next side. Here we are on the driver's side. Little word to the wise, I kind of struggled with the other side getting the pads in there, and I didn't realize once you got the pistons pushed back up in there, you can actually set your pads up inside the bracket here and get them staged before you go ahead and put them up inside the caliper there. So those pistons are pushed back in, got the pads clipped up inside there. The finger springs are holding them in there too. The other side, those springs are still holding them in there. I just had to kind of work around them once I had it mounted up. But I also went ahead on this side, since I had this out anyways, replaced the boots on these pins as well. And we'll get this, the whole front end wrapped up here, and then we'll move to the back. Heck of a lot easier putting them in there first. All right, let's move to the back. So these rear boots look to be in good shape. They're moving nice and free on there as well. We're not gonna risk breaking something off here and taking these out. What I am gonna do is get this caliper pressed back up in here, and then we'll go ahead and get the new pads loaded up on this one. So I lied, went ahead and removed that off of there, slid off easy enough. We'll get the new sliders back on here, and then we'll go ahead and add a little bit of grease up inside there before we slide it back in, and we'll get these pads mounted up. We're all set back here. Onto the passenger side, and that will be it for today. All right, so we got all the calipers loaded up, ready to go. We're gonna get the rotors in later this week, mount them up. Pretty much everything should be plug and play at that point. We'll be back on the road. So a little word to the wise here. You can see that my brake fluid reservoir overflowed. So with how much we pushed those calipers back up in there, that fluid, a lot of it came back here into the top of the system. Just a little bit came out. It's not like a lot came out, but it's enough to remind you that those calipers really are pushing a lot of fluid, especially when they get, real squeezed in, when the pads and the rotors themselves get thinner. So one thing we'll have to do before we pump the system, actually after we pump the system up, we'll come back here, check the fluid level, make sure it's between the max and min line there, just make sure that we're in good shape here for from a fluid level perspective before we go driving. Right, so about 5 weeks later, we got the rotors in the mail. I got the front rotors here. These are the special AC Delco black hat painted rotors, so we don't get that rust on here. And we're gonna go ahead and put the brake calipers on, get the rotors cleaned off with some degreasing cleaner here, and then we'll go to the back and get those done. So the caliper bolt itself needs to be tightened up to 79.6 foot-pounds on the back side here, and I read that on the internet somewhere, so it's got to be true.
Hey Dad, guess what the basketball did? It went up and hit the hoop and it went back.
Oh my gosh. So just a little bit of this on there. You don't need too much. Get some of that rust preventative off of the non-painted parts of this, so you get a nice clean surface for when you go ahead and bed the brakes in. Clean it up on the back side here. All right, let's go ahead and put this rotor on here.
Can you wipe this off of the ball? Passenger front is ready to go. 41 foot-pounds for these bad boys on here. So we got our torque wrench set up to 41 foot-pounds here. All right, passenger rear is good to go. All right, we got the driver's side rear done over here. What we're gonna do is go ahead and, before we start the truck, we're gonna pump up the brakes, and we're gonna sit and think about things for a little while before we put all the tires back on the truck and take it for a test drive during the daytime. All right, we're gonna go ahead and pump the brake up here. I expect it'll go down to the floor the first time we press on it. Yeah, so what we're going is basically filling up the pistons that we retracted up into the calipers when we were making space for the new rotors. So doing a couple of pumps here. Hopefully she pumps up. If she doesn't pump up, then I got all night to think about what went wrong and what we're going to do tomorrow. You can see my breath too, because it's about 4 degrees outside right now. And that's why I don't want to put the tires on tonight either, because I'm going to go inside and have a beer and relax for the rest of the night after hopefully these brakes pump up here. Okay, there we go. Now we're getting a little bit more pressure there. Yeah, that's feeling pretty good now. we're going to walk around each of the calipers and make sure that they're dragging on the rotor once we get outside. Yeah, that's feeling pretty good now. Okay, so here's the driver's side front. Caliper feels nice and tight there. And we got good pad engagement here too. Passenger front, yep. Got good engagement there. Everything looks centered. Dragging just a little bit. Let's go to passenger rear. Oh boy, there we go. Just a little bit of drag there. Now just remember, we're fighting against the other side too with the differential there. So just that it moved a little bit was enough for me to see that we got good engagement back here. Then on the driver's side rear, there we go. That's good too. So we are in good shape for tomorrow. We're gonna go ahead and take a break for the night and get the tires back on and take her for a test drive tomorrow. Before we get the tires on, I want to do a little walk around here, but you can see with those painted rotors, I mean, a lot of times you can get them unpainted. They'll rust after the first rain on the outside, but having that up in there, having some of the black anti-corrosive rust fluid film with the graphite in it up underneath there, this doesn't look too bad for a 11, 12-year-old truck. So it's going to look pretty nice with these wheels back on here. And she'll be good for probably another, I don't know, 75 years or something like that. So yeah, let's get these tires back on. Now, for some people, it's common knowledge. For others who may not have had a vehicle with 6 bolts on the wheel, when you tighten these up, you always want to go in a star pattern. 5 bolts are pretty easy. 6 bolts, you basically want to go to the one that's straight across from it, just like this. You always want to make sure you tighten in order opposite of the other end. Otherwise, you might not get them all torqued down just right. I go back and I check it a second time typically. Ready to go in here. We're going to go ahead and get the truck started here, do a couple of pre-flight checks before we get it on the road. And I'll tell you why. Because yesterday when we had it up in the air and pumped up the brakes inside here with the key off, brakes felt real good. I don't know, it's a little spongier than what I'm used to in other vehicles, especially without the power assist right now. But with these hybrid trucks, they got a bunch of different crazy electronic stuff going on in the braking system. So it's pumped up as far as I can get it up. Well, we're going to go ahead and start it here. My parking brake is on there. All right. Okay. Parking brake is off. Good. No new trouble codes or anything like that coming up on the screen here. Pressing the brake, I mean, it feels about as stiff as it did in the manual braking situation. So I would say it's pretty well pumped up here as far as we're going to go right now. Before we take her out, we're going to go ahead and check the brake fluid reservoir up underneath. Make sure that we got good brake fluid up in here still. You'll remember back when I disassembled everything, we had actually pushed the brake fluid out the top because we had pushed those pistons so far back in. If you look at it here, it's right there, right at the max line. So we're looking pretty good here. We're going to go ahead and take it slowly down the driveway, make sure it stops at least going slow first, and then we're going to take it for a test drive down the road. We're going to do a couple of test stops here as we sit in the driveway, just to make sure. So at least in reverse, holding on the brake moderately here to keep it stopped. It's staying still, and the brakes are releasing there like normal. And there we go. It comes to a nice complete stop there. So pedal pressure actually feels really good. Actually feels better than it did before we swapped out the rotors. So what we're going to do next, we're going to go down the road and try to bed in the brake pad and rotors. We're going to do a series of stops, probably about 40, 50 miles an hour. And then we're going to take it up to about 55, 60, and then do some harder stops at that point.
The key when you're going ahead and bedding in the brakes here is you're going to be building up some heat and really wearing down sort of the high spots in the machining surfaces and on the pads themselves. So you really want to never come to a complete stop as you're doing the heat cycling part of it. Now, you got to stop at stop signs and so forth, obviously, so you want to have a far enough stretch that you can do this a series of times within a mile. But one thing to keep in mind as you're bedding them in, the brakes will get pretty warm, and you don't want to warp your rotors as soon as you put them on. So just something to keep in mind if you're hard on the brakes when you're doing the bedding process. Really be mindful of how long you stay completely stopped after you do some of the hot cycle portions of it. Okay, we're going to make sure we don't have anybody behind us, and we're going to go ahead and do a moderate stop here, 45 miles an hour. Okay, there's our first one. Let's go ahead and watch this oil pressure here. So take advantage of this as a teaching moment for everybody. You know, you can see the oil pressure kind of bouncing around a little bit there. And as that filter gets clogged up and as my RPMs drop, slow down here, that oil pressure will just slowly drop. And basically what's happening is you're just getting all that muck and little pieces of carbon stuck inside the screen filter behind the oil pressure sensor. So it'll just slowly drop. Every time it gets down lower, down below 20, basically I'm just going to pull over. Oh, we had a little bounce there, so maybe she cleared out whatever was in the screen there. But we're going to go ahead and monitor this and take it back, change the oil, and then we're going to do the 60-mile-an-hour slowdowns on the freeway once we get that oil changed and get that screen cleaned out. See, you can see it's kind of getting lower there. We're at about probably 28 psi right now. Typically, cruising speed, we're about 39, 40, just about straight up and down with the needle. And we'll just continue watching this oil pressure gauge as we go along here. Something else to think about, you know, people see the oil pressure slowly drops as you're driving along. You know, we're at about 20% of oil life left, so we're at a time where we got to change the oil anyways. But people think that their engine all of a sudden is getting all worn out and just gonna, you know, all the bearings, everything are shot, and you lose oil pressure. Yeah, that used to be the case typically, but with these displacement on demand GM trucks, I think a lot of times what ends up happening is these oil screens get clogged and they basically block off the oil to the camshaft and so forth at the top of the engine. And, you know, you end up suffering damage if you drive around with the pressure at zero. It's not necessarily on your rod bearings and so forth down on the bottom end, but you definitely get that up on the top end with the camshaft, up the upper end of the motor. So you don't want to drive around for too long below that 20 psi mark. You can see as we slowed down here, dipped to below 20 psi. It's going to dip right down to zero here probably soon. So we're about 10 psi. We're going to go ahead and restart the truck over here and get it pumped up one more time before we get home. And sure enough, she pumps up to about 38 there as soon as we turn it on. So it's not like the engine is cooled down at all. And basically what's happened is just that screen is getting clogged up in there and it's blocking the oil from getting to the pressure sensor in the top part of the engine. We're going to restart it one more time for good measure here. And this ought to be good enough to get us home. Would help if I put it in drive. Geez, I just about thought we had a transmission problem there for a second too. Maybe the truck's trying to tell me something. Maybe the brakes aren't the only thing that's going on here. But you can see, the pressure's up above 40. It's in the normal range where we want it to be right now. So we're going to limp her home, and I'll do the oil change and finish the bedding process later. She's doing it again, so this will probably be the fourth time that the oil pressure drops in this bedding in process. But people say, well, just go ahead and put on these components and turn off displacement on demand. All right, go ahead and do that on any other truck, but you really defeat the purpose of having a fuel-efficient hybrid Yukon if you're turning off displacement on demand. So I'm going to limp this along as far as we can go with keeping the V4 active here, and she'll run for a while as long as you keep working on it. So aside from the oil pressure dropping down to zero while we were doing the bedding process, the brakes feel really good. I think the brakes are ready to go on the truck. We just got to go ahead and clean out that oil pressure sensor screen, change the oil, and she'll be back on the road.